And I hope we have once again reminded people that man is not free unless government is limited. There's a clear cause and effect here that is as neat and predictable as a law of physics. As government expands, liberty contracts.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
The Liberty Podcast is brought to you by Proven Arms and Outfitters, specializing in rifles, pistols, tactical gear, and more. Learn more at ProvenOutfitters.com.
Hey, welcome back to the Liberty Podcast. It is the 29th day of August, 2024. And boy, are we in countdown mode now, ladies and gentlemen. Full-blown election season is upon us. I know some people are thinking about football season, but we've got a bigger game to win than those played between the end zones, my friends. Here are some numbers that will astonish you. The first one is 7. 7 days from now, as you're viewing this, North Carolina will begin to mail absentee ballots to those who request them. So in essence, in a little over a week, ballots will be in play. Ballots will be in front of voters in North Carolina. In 48 days from now, early voting will begin. That's on October 17 across Moore County and across the state of North Carolina. And then 67 days from now will be Election Day, November 5, 2024. The date we have had circled for lo these many months. Speaking of ballots, the Democrats, they never relent in trying to do everything they can to distort outcomes in their favor. So as you know, very recently, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. dropped out, essentially, of the race for president. He said he was suspending his campaign. Kind of a nuanced, semantic nuance there, but nonetheless, for all intents and purposes, he's out. So instead of removing his name from the ballot immediately in North Carolina, they decided to go ahead and print him with his name still on there. And now the ballot is posted to the Moore County Board of Elections and State Board of Elections websites. I have one on my desk. And who's listed as a candidate for President of the United States? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as an independent. So you know what that's potentially going to do is unnecessarily bleed some votes away from Donald Trump and the Republicans, because there will be uninformed, low information voters who still think that Robert F. Kennedy is running. In fact, he said just the opposite when he suspended. He said, in the battleground states, please shift your support to Donald Trump. That is my wish, and I will be supporting him. And of course, since then, to that time, they've had the big rally in Phoenix. That was a week ago already. And it has been announced that RFK has a role in the Trump campaign and potentially in the transition upon his election. When Trump is elected fairly between October 17, at least here, and November 5. So there's a few updates for you. Now, the only place this time of the year and this election season that you're hearing more about polls are in Poland. But boy, do we talk about them nonstop. And I think it's important to keep them in perspective, not to rely on them too much to determine how you're feeling about the state of the election and the various campaigns. For example, polls have come out in the last few days governor's race in North Carolina. Mark Robinson, the Republican, down 15 points. Now, how did that happen? In Arizona, they've got Kari Lake running for Senate as a Republican in the latest poll, down 15 points too, 14 to 15 points. What? These races have been much closer up until these polls suddenly appear. Now, many people think it's a tactic to deflate Republicans, to make us feel like, wow, no hope. It's swung too far in the other direction. There's nothing we can do. That's the strategy. Don't fall for it. But also, let's keep in mind that by their very nature, and especially when done recklessly, polls are not entirely accurate a lot of the time. Here is an article by Mark Harris. He writes, if the November election was held today, public polling would drastically underestimate Donald Trump's performance and, to a lesser extent, the Republican parties as a whole. Drastically underestimate. He says, I'm a Republican campaign consultant who has consumed thousands of pages of data. The survey environment is plagued by a large response bias that low-budget public surveys refuse to fix. They know it's there. They don't do anything about it. The foundation assumes that every respondent, the foundation of polling, assumes that every respondent is equally likely to take a given survey, which is false. Pollsters have two tools to help them adjust for this reality. The first is quotas. The argument in favor of quotas relies on historical voter turnout to model future turnout. Opponents of restrictive quotas argue that a poll may miss changes in group dynamics or the collapse of a particular group. This debate was less of an issue 20 years ago when everyone had landlines, telephones, and response rates across all groups were fairly high. Today, with extremely low response rates, the response bias has become very pronounced. Okay? In a recent internal statewide survey in a large state, people with a graduate degree were 5.5 times more likely to answer the survey than those without a degree, while people with a bachelor's degree were 3 times more likely. This doesn't take into account a fascinating response bias developing around population density. Pollsters often divide geography into urban, suburban, and rural segments by population density. In recent surveys, there has been a pronounced drop-off in rural white working class responses, with some of the quotas being filled in by suburban and urban white working class voters who are much more likely to be Democratic in orientation. He continues, with Kamala Harris as the nominee for president, Democrat, politically engaged, wealthy, educated white voters are taking up too many spots in the Democratic polling quotas, pushing out downscale, lower turnout Democrats who are much more likely to be undecided or Trump voters. Whereas a college-educated Democrat might be 95% for Harris, a non-college one might be 88%. That 7-point gap matters and is not reflected in public polling. And then he writes, don't take my word for it. Politico, which is a left-leaning social media and digital website, Politico reported that even Democratic pollsters are admitting that their internal, read expensive in parentheses, their internal surveys are much less optimistic about Kamala Harris. In these internal surveys, which tend to be much more accurate, and which is what the candidates and the campaigns really follow the most. Not all these ones that are splashed all over your smartphones and your television. So that's some important context about polls that you must constantly keep in mind. Speaking of which, here comes a poll. Economist YouGov poll. Economist/YouGov, a collaborative poll between those two entities, conducted from August 25 through 27, so very recently. It found this, putting aside all of the other areas in which Kamala Harris seems to be leading Trump in overall areas, in specific policy areas. It's very peculiar to those of us paying attention. But the poll discovers that there is one potential challenge for Harris, and that is that respondents report having a less clear understanding of what she would do if elected president. Only 51% said they had a very clear or somewhat clear understanding of the policies she would enact as president. So you're telling me that half of these people have no idea what she's even going to do if she ever gets in the White House, God forbid? This is really interesting. So the 51% very clear or somewhat clear understanding compared to 67% who said the same thing about Trump. 67% know what they're getting with Trump, and that's part of the reason that they're behind him. And it helps that he was president already, so we have a historical track record. Among independents, only 37% said they had a somewhat clear or very clear understanding of Harris's policies. So around a third, they don't know either. While 43% said they had a not very clear or not clear at all idea of what she would do. In contrast, 61% of independents said they had a very or somewhat clear understanding of Trump policies and what he would enact. Despite some uncertainty about Harris's potential policies, her slight edge in favorability on policy likely contributed to her narrow lead in this poll. I think it's 47 to 45 overall. This lead is particularly significant as it's only the second poll released that examined the multi-way race since RFK dropped out. But again, look deeper and you're seeing that people are saying, really, I have no idea what her policy positions are, and by extension, what she would do if she ever becomes president. Now, I don't know who votes with that level of uncertainty or ignorance, but we can't stop them from voting. That's, a fact, Jack. All right. So what happens when you don't know? What is perilous about ignorance toward issues and policies related to the Harris campaign? I choked on that. 2 weeks ago, I had a frog in my throat. Last week, it was a tadpole. Now it's down to a single cell amoeba, but it still rears its little head every now and then and requires me to hydrate immediately. So I pardon the interruption. Well, here's one of the perils of not knowing what's going on with the Harris campaign and her plans for this country. Meet Bharat Ramamurthy. He has never run a business, nor has he ever worked for one. Yet, he's the top economic advisor for the Kamala Harris campaign and a not-so-covert socialist ideologue who intends to cripple the American economy through ruthlessly progressive taxation. So, if you kind of think you like Kamala Harris because she's a woman or because she's pro-abortion, do you feel the same way when you understand the potential disaster of ruthlessly progressive taxation? Before joining the Biden administration as deputy director of the National Economic Council, Mr. Bharat was Senator Elizabeth Warren's senior counsel on economic policy for 8 years. Well, she's about one of the few who are as left as Kamala is in the Senate when they were both senators. Ramamurthy's commitment to progressivism repeatedly revealed itself during his tenure with Senator Warren when he spearheaded her signature proposal for a wealth tax. And you know who else was for that? Kamala Harris. During her brief pass-through as a senator. The wealth tax starts at 2% annually and rises to 6% for those with net assets over $1 billion. I think I heard today that there are 1,700 billionaires in the United States. So, they're coming for you, billionaires. In short, it is a plan to, quote, eat the rich, end quote, and have the government seize the wealth on an annual basis of people determined by the government to have done too well. It reveals a deeply embedded, committed socialist outlook on economics and individual rights, driven into Ramamurti during his time at Harvard and Yale, and defined by the notion that government can act as a fairer and more equitable distributor of wealth than free markets. He is a force for shoving DEI and ESG agendas down the throats of the American people. A top Biden advisor says, quote, he was very conscious of racial equity and distributional impacts. I bet he was. Bharat Ramamurti is one of many dangerous ideologues who staff the Kamala Harris campaign and are likely to achieve top positions in a Harris administration. Usually it's a bit of a political exaggeration to claim that the Democrat Party's platform is nothing but lunatic socialism, but with this Kamala 2024 campaign, that's become a possible reality that America faces with the upcoming election in November. So again, you don't know anything about Kamala, that means you don't know anything about Bharat Bararuti, Mr. Progressive Socialist Marxist economic advisor. Better know about him. Or how about Tim Walz? You know, Tim Walz, the Mandarin Marxist from Minnesota, Kamala Harris's running mate, the would-be vice president of these United States. Do polls reflect any knowledge of his ideological roots? I think that's a good question. Answer, no. Here's a piece from The Federalist, published earlier this week. Headline, under Tim Walz, who is the governor of Minnesota, that's important to remember, under Tim Walz, Minnesota banned Christians from teaching in public schools. Oh no, that's not possible, you say. Effective July 2025, so this is something that was passed and is going to be enacted roughly a year from now in Minnesota. Effective July 2025, teacher licensing rules passed last year in Minnesota under Walz will ban practicing Christians, Jews, and Muslims from teaching in public schools. Well, who's going to teach in them? Martians? Troglodytes? Islamic jihadists? No, it said Muslims, but it didn't say jihadists, so maybe they're carving out a special area for them. Starting next July, Minnesota agencies controlled by Walz appointees will require teacher license applicants to affirm transgenderism and race Marxism. That means you have to be okay with it. Without a teaching license, individuals cannot work in Minnesota public schools nor in the private schools that require such licenses. The latest version of the regulations requires teachers to affirm students' gender identity. That means if little Tommy comes in and says he's now Teresa, the teacher has to affirm that. And also sexual orientation if they wish to receive their teaching license. Huh. Wowza. Wowza, wowza. That's amazing. Since 2020, so this has been around for a while, this wackadoodle-doo under Walz. Since 2020, teachers renewing their licenses, which is usually required every 5 to 7 years, must demonstrate, quote, cultural competency, end quote, similar to the requirements imposed coming in 2025. Teachers renewing their licensing must show evidence of self-reflection and discussion of topics that include gender identity, including transgender students and sexual orientation. They must also show they understand bias in themselves and their students related to race, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other cultural Marxist categories. Folks, you can't make this stuff up. I'm here to tell you right now. Now, this continues. This continues here. It also affects the students, not just the teachers. Mr. Walls signed a law establishing in 2023 department standards and benchmarks require first graders to identify examples of ethnicity, equality, liberation, and systems of power, and use those examples to construct meanings for those terms. First graders. How about teaching them how to read and do math, which many of them can't do when they graduate these days? It's certainly true in North Carolina. Fourth graders must identify the processes and impacts of colonization and examine how discrimination and the oppression of various racial and ethnic groups have produced resistance movements. High school students are told to develop an analysis of racial capitalism and anti-blackness, and are taught to view themselves as members of racialized hierarchies based on, quote, dominant European beauty standards. So in other words, it's full-blown insanity in Minnesota, governed by Tim Walz, who was selected by Kamala to be his running mate. And she's trying to moderate on her positions. I don't know how she thinks she's going to do that with this clown as her running mate. He's got a track record that is left of any Marxists in the Senate, like Bernie Sanders, for sure. He's supposed to be, the harmless former high school football coach, which, by the way, I don't think he ever got past like coaching the JV team. So he's marginally a football coach. I probably know more about football than he does, actually. Here's one more cautionary note about polls and about what they mean now and as we move forward in these final months. This is written at substack.com by Roy Teixeira. He spells it R-U-Y. Do you suppose it's still Roy? Rui Teixeira. Headline, Democrats are super happy. Working class voters are not. Here he goes. Democrats are not just happy, they are ecstatic. Harris has surged into a modest lead over Trump in national polls and is doing well enough in swing states for her to be a slight favorite to win the Electoral College and therefore the election. The Democratic National Convention seemed to be a smashing success with delegate enthusiasm at a fever pitch. However, look more closely into the polling, he says, working class voters have a more restrained enthusiasm. First, he says, let's take a look at the Washington Post ABC News Ipsos poll. That's a three-way poll right there. Washington Post ABC News Ipsos. So this is a left-biased poll right out of the blocks. In this poll, Harris is ahead of Trump by 3 or 4 points, depending on whether other candidates are included. But among working class, non-college voters, Harris trails Trump by 7 points. Working class, non-college educated voters, Harris trails Trump by 7 points, while leading among college educated voters by 20 points. This is both somewhat worse than Biden did among working class in 2020 and somewhat better than Biden did among college educated voters by 18 points. So Harris is 18 points ahead of where Biden was in 2020 on the college-educated voter support. Now, the same pattern applies to white voters. Harris is doing somewhat better than Biden among white college voters, but somewhat worse among white working-class voters. And among non-white working-class voters, she is still underperforming Biden, who carried these voters by 48 points. Harris is ahead by only 29. Among the working class, Trump gets a 47% retrospective job approval rating because he was president for 4 years, while Harris gets just a 34% rating, who has been vice president for nearly 4 years. Among the college educated, it's just the reverse. Harris gets 47% job approval, and Trump gets only 38%. So the point here, ladies and gentlemen, is again, you look at the top number, you look at the headline number out of these polls, and you take that to mean, oh, Harris is leading. But then when you look more deeply, you see that she has many vulnerabilities, especially among the non-college educated working class, which, by the way, are not the people who congregate at big, expensive conventions in cities like Chicago. It's just a fact, with few exceptions. Then he looks at another poll, the latest Fox News poll. Well, it used to be considered more of a center-right poll. I don't know if it is now. In terms of favorability, working class voters give Harris a 44% favorability rating and Trump a 52% favorability rating. Working class voters heavily favor Trump in terms of favorability. Kind of a vague term, but it is what it is. College-educated voters are basically the reverse. They give Harris a 54% favorability rating and Trump just a 38% rating. So this begs the question, where it gets us back to Tim Walz. Well, first of all, it says to us, as Republicans, we better work on these working class voters who feel the pinch of Bidenomics, of persistent inflation, of high energy costs. They feel it every day, and it's not going away based on what they're telling these pollsters. And this leads us back to the peculiar Tim Walz of Minnesota. His ascension looks to be fully in keeping with the Democrats' shifting coalition. For if woke has peaked, Harris seems not to have known it when she selected him. In other words, the Democrats' shifting coalition is going away from woke and more toward practicality, especially among the very important working class vote. Given that Harris appears now to want to backtrack from and minimize her distinctly far-left messaging in 2019-20, when she said she was running for president, which ranged from the sublime, working to bail out rioters, remember that, the Summer of Love, and affirming the righteousness of the disorder of the summer of 2020, calling to decriminalize illegal border crossings, and endorsing a ban on fracking. These were her positions when she was a presidential candidate in 19 and 20. Okay? How about that? Okay, here we go. She also had some ridiculous positions in 2020. She got sucked into the Juicy Smollett hoax. Remember when said he was attacked by MAGA hat-wearing guys in the streets of Chicago, in the Gold Coast, where there are no MAGA hats being worn? It is therefore curious that as she's backtracking now in 2024, that she made Walz her running mate. There is nary an enthusiasm of contemporary cultural progressivism that he has not indulged to the hilt. To the hilt. In sum, it's a long road back to the working class for the Democrats. As they leave their convention with visions of electoral sugar plums dancing in their heads, they should remember that they still have far to go. I think that's very important. And I think you're seeing now that we have about a week of separation from the end of the convention and all the sweaty wrist wringing and moistened undergarments, that polling is starting to settle, and certainly we can say with assurance that she got no major bump from the convention, and what she did was not enough to sustain her past a couple of weeks. And need I remind you, there are months still in play here that she has to survive and try to be dragged across the finish line by the media. Now, let's move to some other news items real quickly here on this 29th day of August. Axios.com, boy, are they upset. Growing numbers of Americans are buying into misinformation about COVID-19 vaccines, according to a new national survey. More than 1 in 5 believe it's safer to get the virus than to get a shot. Well, for a lot of healthy younger Americans, I think that's certainly logical. Absolutely. Belief and misconceptions is stoking vaccine hesitancy, with the nation facing a summer surge of infections. Yeah, the left is getting all excited about COVID tests and positives and people wearing masks again. They're very excited about the return to the 2021-22 hysteria. More COVID-related hospitalizations and updated shots are now reaching the pharmacy. Okay, they're very excited. But this poll, the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Public Policy Center, further evidence of how intense backlash to the government's at times muddled COVID response eroded trust in public health, jeopardizing preparedness to address future crises. 28% of respondents to the survey incorrectly believe that COVID-19 vaccines have been responsible for thousands of deaths. Axios is just telling you that these people incorrectly believe that? How can you assign that to someone's belief? What is it based in? 22% believe the false idea that it's safer to get a COVID infection than to get the vaccine, up from 10% in 2021, except for the fact that it is, and by the way, that's the only way you achieve natural immunity to anything, is to have endured the infection and come out the other end of it, which again, unless you have multiple comorbidities, is going to be the case. I hate to disappoint you, hysterical morons on the left. For example, you may have heard of a guy named Edward Dowd. This guy was a major league hedge fund financial strategist with BlackRock and others. In 2020, he saw this ridiculous phenomenon occurring around the pandemic, and being inquisitive about it, he wanted to know what was going on. So he took a full 180 in his life in March of 2020, and then continued as he began to question the motive around vaccine passports and started looking more closely at the use of data in understanding the realities of the COVID pandemic. He's a data guy. He ended up writing a book entitled Cause Unknown: The Epidemic of Sudden Deaths in 2021 and 2022, which explores in the most intricate detail why we have seen a sudden surge of deaths in working age people that most significantly were not attributed to COVID-19. Well, I wonder what they were attributed to. The untested experimental serums that were inaccurately categorized as vaccines. They never were. They still aren't. And the FDA rolled out a whole new approval of vaccines a few days ago. And here we go again. Get your jab, get your jab, get your jab. It's like we've learned nothing. Well, we have, those of us who are informed and paying attention. Ed found that insurance companies were seeing a 40% increase in excess mortality among working class age adults during the fourth quarter of 2021. 40% increase in excess death. Millennials aged 25 to 44 had an 84% increase in excess mortality during the same time frame. And most significantly, since the rollout of the vaccine, the number of Americans who claim to be disabled has risen by at least 10%. So why is Axios surprised that more people, not less, have grown suspicious of the downside, in some case the very dangerous downside, of this fake vaccine? Now, the guy who invented mRNA technology, Robert Malone, MD, earlier this year posted a very poignant piece in which he revealed that he had been the victim of his own technology, that he had, in fact, become among the multitudes of the vaccine injured during the pandemic. He writes that he was very happy to see a February 2021 study published in which the vaccine was blamed for these many cases of what it referred to as long COVID, meaning people recover from the major symptoms, but they continue to have lethargy and fogginess, brain fog. Some of them just find it very hard to function in a workplace environment or just in their day-to-day life. Here's what he wrote. That study matters to me because in April of 2021, I received 2 doses of the Moderna inoculation. See, he calls it what it is, an inoculation, not a vaccine. And he got it almost directly after it had been made available. That decision has altered my health irrevocably. Thank you for using that word, irrevocably. Before taking the jab, I first phoned Dr. Peter Marks, the director of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research at the FDA. Malone knows people in high places. He assured me that although the clinical trials had been rushed, no shortcuts had been taken, and that there were no safety signals or cause for alarm regarding the C-19 quote-unquote vaccines based on the more complete Pfizer documentation he had received. As I have spoken about time and again, I took the jab for 2 main reasons. One reason was the governmental threats that travel would soon become impossible without verification of having taken the vaccine, ergo the threat of vaccine passport requirements. The second reason was that the scientific community and mainstream media were reporting that the quote vaccine, end quote, would reduce the symptoms of long COVID. You see, I was a sufferer of long COVID, as I had contracted COVID-19 in February 2020. It hit me hard, but I did treat myself and managed to stay out of the hospital. However, shortness of breath, fatigue, brain fog, etc. continued into 2021. So, the guy's saying, who's doubting that long COVID exists? But the real question is, why does it exist? Earlier this week, the Wall Street Journal on the front page of its newspaper reported that 1 million Americans had been driven out of the workplace because they suffer from long COVID and they just can't hold down a job. They can't function. I read the whole article and it never once mentioned any possible causes other than long COVID remains a mystery to researchers, scientists, and physicians. Well, it's not a mystery to people who are doing their homework and reading the work of Dr. Robert Malone, who suffers from long COVID and knows why. Because of the experimental jabs that were never intended, according to him, Malone, should never have been used to treat the Wuhan COVID virus. Period. All right, I'm just going to quickly hit on a couple of things here, and then we'll be out the door for the big Labor Day weekend. You got to start paying attention to this SAVE Act. Okay, now the SAVE Act was passed by the House of Representatives earlier this year. It is a conservative-backed push for stricter proof of citizenship requirements for voting. Seems like Americans should be voting and non-Americans should not be voting in our elections. However, the SAVE Act did pass the House in a mostly partisan vote, but 5 Democrats backed the bill as well. There is also recognition among right-wing proponents like Chip Roy of Texas that coupling the SAVE Act with a stopgap CR can be leveraged for a bigger priority, which would be to extend current government funding with the intention of avoiding a sprawling 12-bill omnibus funding package. So in other words, what you're going to see coming up is we're going to find out whether or not Speaker of the House Mike Johnson has the stones to say to the Senate, if you want a deal on the spending resolution to fund the government through the end of 2024, you must enact the SAVE Act to make sure that only American citizens vote, that they have to prove that they're citizens before they can vote, period. Now, if we don't do the spending continuing resolution, what's going to happen? You've heard this before. The government's going to shut down. To which I always say, let it shut down. For once, we could use a break from government, from bureaucracy. And every day that it's shut down, that actually means a little bit less runaway spending. It doesn't stop it, but it means a little bit less. Wouldn't that be nice? Just once. So keep your eye on the SAVE Act. It's going to come into play. It might be a little overshadowed by the election, but you need to tell your Congressman Richard Hudson and Mike Johnson, the Speaker, to stay the course on this bill and attach it to any spending resolutions to fund the government and get it in stone where it belongs for once. Here's kind of a humorous article that was published in this month's September edition of The Atlantic magazine, which is a very left-leaning, Trump-hating entity, but nonetheless, it is worth reading. The prayers, it analyzes the prayers offered before Trump speaks at his rallies. And the author, McKay Coppins, say that the prayers that he hears at Trump rallies illuminate a perilous moment in American politics, as well as anything that Trump says from the podium. And they help explain how the stakes of this year's election have come to feel so apocalyptically high. First I get irrevocably, and now I get apocalyptically. But anyway, I pulled it off. He says that to understand the evolving psychology and beliefs of Trump's religious supporters, as if, two-headed monsters, those religious supporters, the author said, I attempted to review every prayer offered at Trump campaign events since he announced in November 2022 that he would run again. I worked with a researcher and I compiled 58 in total, the most recent from June 2024. The resulting document makes for a strange, revealing text, benign in some places, blasphemous in others. Okay, this is interesting. Trump's supporters attribute America's fall from grace to a variety of national sins, old and new. Prayer bans in public schools, illegal immigration, pro-transgender policies, the purported rigging of a certain recent election. Whatever the specifics, the picture of America they paint is almost universally, biblically bleak. In Wildwood, New Jersey, a pastor declared, quote, our nation finds itself in turmoil, chaos, and dysfunction, end quote. In Fort Dodge, Iowa, the sentiment was similar. Quote, lies, corruption, and propaganda are driving civilization to ruins, end quote. In Conway, South Carolina, one supplicant informed God, quote, our enemies are trying to steal, kill, and destroy our America, so we need you, the Almighty, to intervene. The premise of all of these prayers is that America's covenant can be reestablished and its special place in God's kingdom restored if the nation repents and turns back to Him. So this guy's very skeptical of these praying, scripture-quoting Christians who support Trump. And this article essentially, and his research essentially sets out to mock them in print in full once and for all. He goes on, it's easy to see the danger in internalizing the concept of politics as spiritual combat. Is it dangerous or is it inevitable? He continues, Trump's rallies become more than mere campaign events. They are staging grounds in a supernatural conflict that pits literal angels against literal demons for the soul of the nation. I think that's a very accurate observation on his part. I've said this for months. This isn't red versus blue or black versus white. It's good versus evil. Conservative Republicans, wrapped in the cloak of God against the evil of the Marxist, godless socialists led by Barack Hussein Obama. He says that if you marinate enough in these ideas, the consequences of defeats start to feel existential. Quote, this is not a time for politics as usual, end quote, said a Pentecostal preacher at a Trump rally in Iowa last year. Quote, it's not a time for religion as usual. It's not a time for prayers as usual. This is a time for spiritual warriors to arise and to shake the heavens. The author continues, as I was reviewing these prayers, I wondered what Trump's most zealous religious supporters would do if they didn't get the result they were praying for in November. With so much riding on the idea that Trump's reelection has a divine mandate, what would happen if he lost? A destabilizing crisis of faith? Another widespread rejection of the election's outcome? Further spasms of political violence? It wasn't until I came across a prayer delivered in Corralville, Iowa, that a more urgent question occurred to me. What will they do if their prayers are answered? In other words, these crazy Christian Bible reading, prayerful Americans, what if they win? What are they going to do to the rest of us? Oh, I don't know. Jail people like Anthony Fauci and Alejandro Mayorkas, the DHS chief who has allowed 10 to 12 million people to pour into our country across the southern border. Anthony Fauci, whose reckless disregard for safety protocols essentially unleashed the Wuhan virus in late 2019, early 2020. I could go on. How about Nancy Pelosi, who deliberately allowed the Capitol on January 6, 2021 to be vulnerable to a few crazy people, which has become now January 6th, the insurrection. How about that? How about Jack Smith, the fraudulent special counsel? How about these other district attorneys and judges who have tried to convict, and in some cases succeeded convicting Trump on sham misdemeanor crimes? How about all of that? Yes, there will be a reckoning. There has to be. So that wraps it up for this Liberty Podcast. We're so glad you joined us on this 29th day of August, 2024. And we'll hope to see you again right here next time.